Okay, thank you so much for being here. If there's any kind of tech issue, you can always just let me know. I'm very tech incompetent, so I'm sure it'll be my fault. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dan, for letting me talk about this book today. I'm calling this Party Strength and Democratic Capitalism, but there are just a few different sort of aspects of political parties that I talk about in this book that I just wrote called The Great Retreat. And I'd love to, just kind of hit the high points of the book in a kind of summary fashion and get into any more detail in the Q&A. So a brief outline of the talk is first, the kind of motivations based on things that are happening in the actual world, then a kind of academic scholarly debate about what constitutes party strength, which I think remains a puzzle in political science. And finally, we'll conclude by talking about the relationship of democracy and capitalism, which seems to be under threat today, to put it mildly. So first, let's take you back to 2016, when Rob and I were just saying that starting in 2016, 2017, I feel like I saw Rob and Dan a lot because there were suddenly all these gatherings of academics to talk about the state of democracy around the world. This is the time when populism was being thrown around the word and illiberalism. And we've seen all of these books, scholarly and popular books, that tell us democracy is in decline. Most of these books focus on some aspect of the crisis of democracy that include indicators like low trust, low levels of democratic legitimacy among voting publics, high levels of political polarization, lower democracy watchdog scores. So Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit say that since 2005, there's been less democratic sort of a decline in democracy, or what my colleague Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession. And finally, a rise in a political rhetorical style of populism, where politicians increasingly demonize the political elite as a cabal of political and economic elites, and also a rise in illiberalism, or kind of erosion of the liberal institutions that sustain democracy, including freedom of the opposition, freedom of the press, and minority rights. But we could also say the same thing about capitalism. Around the same time, especially after President Trump was elected in 2016, there was a debate about whether or not this was, high levels of racism in the American electorate, or if instead it was economic anxieties and status anxieties brought on by new variants of capitalism. So we've seen here a set of critiques of capitalism, particularly neoliberalism, that talk about the widespread inequality that's resulted from these changes from the past 40 years. And it's hard to separate these two, although I think we typically think about a crisis of democracy as distinct from a crisis of capitalism. They're inextricably intertwined. There are challenges of contemporary capitalism that seem limited to the economic sphere. For example, neoliberal economic policies, globalization and economic integration, and financialization of the economy. It's Greta Krippner, colleague here, I don't know where the Soch building is, has written so compellingly about. But we see that democratic institutions are themselves more beholden to capital. There's a high level of responsiveness to wealth and capital, what the political scientists call affluence bias in policymaking. And there's also been a rise in extreme wealth inequality. And this is endogenous to the political system because people with greater resources can then get what they want out of policymaking more easily than the rest of the electorate. So what is it that's not working in this relationship of democracy and capitalism? It's any number of things, but what this book is going to try to focus on is first the problem of political economy, the way economic anxieties are now translating into widespread discontent rather than a set of crystallized demands. And second of all, a problem of representation. It's not just the case that our institutions may be minoritarian or that they may be outdated, all of which could be the case, but it's also that the intermediaries that connect citizens to their governments don't seem to be effectively channeling the interests or demands of the public, or segments of the public at least. Hence, this book, which I guess you could say began pre-COVID, wrapped up post-COVID, and was written in isolation in the in-between times. So this book makes an argument about why it's important to have political parties retain or reinvigorate their intermediary role and functions. It describes a history of parties in a neoliberal era and the changes to party organization that have made them less able to fulfill those functions. And finally, it's a book primarily about and aimed at American audiences, but it draws on a broad comparative literature that I think is useful for Americans to keep in mind. Now, we've seen decades of rising anti-party sentiment. And in fact, Americans have hated parties for as long as America has existed. But there are sort of trends across the advanced democracies today that show that people themselves are pretty sick of parties. There have been declining vote shares for mainstream parties of the center right and center left that dominated post-war political competition in Western Europe. And these are 21 democracies that are footnoted in tiny font there. There's been a rise instead in challenger, or what Jonathan Hopkins calls anti-system parties, especially in Western Europe or in places with multi-party democracy. And mainstream parties have largely struggled to adapt when new issues are salient, and the political parties of the mainstream tend to agree. So if there's kind of a consensus about economics or about immigration, new parties can capitalize on the kind of vacuum in representation that the mainstream parties aren't filling. In the United States, where we have less kind of membership-based parties, we still see a trend, despite time of rising polarization, that people are rejecting party labels, the Republicans and Democratic parties, and instead identifying increasingly as independents. A plurality of Americans now identify as independents, upwards of 40%, and more Americans say that they don't like either party. Now, there's long been a conventional wisdom in American politics that independents are leaners. The myth of the independent voter, for example, tells us that they're basically Republicans and Democrats. They just don't like labels. They vote very consistently one way or the other. But there's recent research by Krupnikov and Clark, for example, in a great book a few years ago, showing that independent voters are different in their orientation to the political system. They tend to be more cynical, more likely to think of politics as corrupt, and more troublingly, less likely to engage politically. And that is a trend. Yesterday, our colleague Vince was saying that there isn't ANES data from 2024 yet, but at least there are accounts from exit polls and surveys that people who felt kind of disenchanted by politics overall were much less likely to vote in 2024. Now, this then motivates, like the rise in anti-party sentiment, not only potentially leads to distrust in democracy, but it motivates how reformers think about the political system. We've seen a lot of reformers take aim at the party system. So here, for example, there's an organization that asks you to put country over party, and they advocate nonpartisan primary elections, especially what you might have heard of as a top 4 or top 5 system where all the candidates run together, and that way the best candidate can win. We don't have to mess with parties as the gatekeepers of candidates. Similarly, Andrew Yang's Forward Party is part of a trend throughout American history of trying to create just a smarter third party that can transcend this two-party duopoly that we have. The problem with these third parties is they rarely represent anyone, right? They're like kind of going around in search of an issue that might resonate with people, but they don't spring from some kind of grassroots segment or base of support. And overall, the reforms that these kinds of activists support, these are all the top 4, top 5 ranked choice voting reforms, don't really resonate with the public. In 2024, these were ballot initiatives that I think were kind of anti-party or erosion of party reform efforts. They had lots, like millions and millions of dollars of donor support, but they're kind of elite and technocratic reforms. And the public largely did not vote for them. So this leads us to kind of a puzzle. We hate parties, we continue to vote for them. We rely on them to be the organizing principle of competitive representative democracy. But we also feel as if parties are not doing their basic job to represent interests. So what is it that makes parties strong or weak? In the book, I talk a little bit about Tammany Hall. My first book was about clientelism in the United States and focused on the 19th century. So I will not say that I have nostalgia for boss politics, but I do think it represents an era of party building that we should keep in mind. Tammany Hall is known for corruption, graft, kickbacks, which New York City has fully solved that problem, so thank God. But in Plunkett's day, you also had a very active party machine. And the way it worked was a very highly localized, decentralized network of party bosses that were responsible for kind of maintaining party loyalty in a very local neighborhood. George Washington Plunkett, a very famous Tammany Hall boss, in one day did the following things. He bailed someone out of jail. He went and rescued people from a fire. Fires are great vote getters. He placed people in jobs with various infrastructure in the municipal government. He attended many different churches. He himself did not specify which denomination was his, went to a local baseball game, gave a wedding present, and then ended the night at 9 p.m. with a district captain's meeting where there was a long line of voters asking for more stuff. And then we get to today. I could ask you to tell me what these two candidates say about the political parties or the state of the parties, but I suspect a lot of what we would hear is negative, at least according to the media. One narrative about the Republican Party is that it's basically become taken over through a potentially hostile takeover, but potentially a little de-democratic process, that has turned it into a personalist vehicle for an individual's pursuit of power. We know this because President Trump is the de facto leader of the Republican Party. He has installed his family members in the RNC, and he's now really utilizing the state as leverage for personal political goals. But it's not as if the Democrats necessarily, they are not as personalized as the Republican Party, but the Democrats also seem to be in disarray. They've received their fair share of finger pointing and blame after the 2024 election, that maybe their candidate nomination process was flawed, that they don't have issues that resonate with the American voters. And donors now are, they were mad about Biden's debate showing in June, and they're now mad about how the Democrats don't seem to have a strategy for 2026. So parties are strong in the sense that they are highly disciplined and ideologically distinct. And those of you who are familiar with the 1950s APSA task force on political parties, that task force was sort of designed to investigate why parties were weak. And their argument was we needed more disciplined, divided parties. And that's what we've got. They're well-financed, they're very professionalized, and they continue to win elections. But they're also weak in the sense that they can't seem to mediate across factions or come up with some kind of overarching ideological programmatic agenda. They play much less role in candidate selection. There have been a lot of books about the McGovern-Fraser reforms in particular and the plebiscitary nature of political parties. So why is it that we have this division in how we think about party strength? Well, the first reason is because I think we live in an era, at least, where we think excessively of parties as election-getting organizations above all else. Most theories of parties do emphasize some dimension of electoral legislative politics. Schumpeter said parties are part of the competitive struggle for the people's vote. John Aldrich's famous formulation from the 90s, 1995, argues that parties are just politicians, office seekers, and office holders. And most recently, the Party Decides School from UCLA argues that parties are just groups of policy demanders. So this is an elite view of parties as people who want to win elections. But that ignores, or at least is hard to square with, another long-standing tradition, in comparative politics at least, of parties as intermediary organizations that are socially embedded, representative membership groups. They reflect the historical social divisions present at critical junctures around the nation's founding, according to Lipset and Rocan. They mobilize, educate, and socialize voters into the practice of democracy. And most importantly, they connect social demands to representation. They create coherence out of the many different heterogeneous, disparate demands that exist in the electorate. And finally, I will note that there have always been trade-offs between a party's sort of representative integrity and its electability. So you have scholars who have written about the catch-all party, parties that move to the center, that don't really represent anyone very well, are much more likely to kind of compete on valence issues rather than position issues. Or Panebianco's claim that the Electoral Professional Party in 1988 is just going to be a bunch of technocratic strategists who don't really have any kind of representational linkages. And finally, Katzenmayer in the 1990s put forward a thesis of the cartel party in Western Europe, parties that receive state subsidies and subventions and therefore don't need to even cater to their membership followings anymore. And we know that political parties have undergone these kinds of changes, but in the book, I go into more detail about historical party development to indicate that it wasn't always the case that parties just cared about winning national elections, because they developed with different capacities over different periods of time as democracy expanded. In the 1840s, with the process of suffrage expansion underway, there was an elimination of property requirements to vote, and you had elite factions within the legislature that were kind of proto-parties that then needed some way to mobilize these newly enfranchised voters. They created local party organizations. They went out and mobilized voters, went knocking door to door. Parties printed the earliest newspapers when we had partisan media. They often created a lot of fanfare around elections, rallies, and parades to make it fun. There was definitely vote buying at the time. But there was a sense that parties were going to organize the actual machinery of elections themselves. And to do so, they needed some kind of organizational infrastructure to do it. Then, as you get into the industrialization era, when we shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy, parties do something different, which is they start to use policy programs to win votes rather than just rely on vote buying. There's a growth of the administrative state where the government says, okay, we will actually provide you with public goods and services, and then there will be a policy feedback loop where then we can engender loyalties that way rather than buying votes in every election. There's also a rise in labor activism and new kinds of civic associations that had longstanding ties to political parties. And then in the 1930s and 1960s, you really get the era of the mass organization party, where, for example, union affiliation meant that you were also very likely to vote for the Democratic Party. You also have like more linkages between conservative parties and other kinds of organizations like religious groups. And this is the era in which you get the compromise of democratic capitalism. For a long time, critics of capital, like Karl Marx, were very cynical about the idea that democracy could ever really provide a bulwark against capitalism. But here, in this era, you see parties institutionalizing what John Kenneth Galbraith referred to as countervailing power. It wasn't just big capital that dominated, but you can also bring big government, big labor to bear on some salient political debates. And the government will provide the public goods, infrastructure, and safety net necessary to let capitalism thrive. So in other words, this is the period that made democracy safe for capitalism, and that is precisely what has frayed today. Now, we also have a lot of empirical evidence that strong parties are good for democracy. They channel distinct interests into representation, but they constrain personalism by enabling a long-term view through partisan brand attachments, as Noam Lupu has argued. They create these healthy partisan attachments that then inculcate ideas of citizenship, and they institutionalize the countervailing power from before. But what is it about party strength that matters for these outcomes? And so I'll just point to some more sort of scholarly work here that describes how we might operationalize and measure intermediary strength within parties, although it's still very hard to do. In a recent World Politics article trying to link strong parties to economic growth, Bizzarro and a bunch of co-authors who work on the VDEM project find that you really need unified, centralized, stable, complex parties that are tied to longstanding constituencies. Mainwaring's idea of party system institutionalization is you want stable competition that's rooted in society, where all major actors accord legitimacy to the electoral process, and you have solid organizations that remain stable over time. In his study of the British conservative parties in Western Europe, Daniel Ziblatt argues that a hierarchical mass party is the kind that can keep extremism at bay. The way that it works is through a widespread geographic presence of local associations and radical reactionary groups that are subordinated and contained by the party. I think today what we find, drawing on the ideas in this literature, is that parties are very effective electoral organizations, but less effective intermediaries. They're basically operating as affinity groups, according to a lot of people who work on the affective polarization literature. The party as an organization focuses exclusively on electoral goals through fundraising, advertising, and campaign strategies. And there's been an expansion of this professional politics industry, polling and consulting firms rather than, for example, active voter engagement to try to figure out and divine which issues are going to resonate with the electorate. And there's also been less attention to the sort of civic groups that once sustained the party and to the local and state parties that once constituted really the kind of like labor force of the party itself. So how did these changes happen? To fast forward, like sort of keep taking you through the book, parties in a neoliberal era have changed in a few distinct ways. The first is that they've all become more neoliberal. And this is sometimes a sticking point with audiences outside of academia. It's never hard to convince a group of lefty academics that left parties are more neoliberal, but it is really hard to convince like people who don't study political science that parties of the left and parties of the right don't do the same things that they did in the 1950s. Here, Stephanie Mudge, a sociologist, has measured the content of neoliberalism within party platforms, finding that across 22 OECD countries on laissez-faire approaches to the economy, order and commodification, and white collar and finance, all parties across the political spectrum of the left and right have become more neoliberal, relying less on kind of big state traditional neoliberalism of the Keynesian era. There have also been some comparative lessons from the project of neoliberalism around the world beginning in the 1980s, and in particular, a deinstitutionalization of parties as you got an adoption of neoliberal policies. In a lot of different regions of the world, you had very little party building or organizational infrastructure as policies of structural adjustment were implemented. Parties are often organized less around a traditional left-right economic spectrum than they are around identity, religion, or ethnicity rather than, say, class. And also the policies of neoliberalism themselves, like deregulation and austerity, were often passed by parties that once opposed these kinds of policies. And they also constrain the programmatic choices available to leaders, meaning you have fewer levers within the state to provide public goods, provide services, and do the kinds of things you'd need to do to convince the voting public that you're responsive. You see a similar trend in Europe when the project of the EU across the 1990s and early 2000s takes economic policies out of contestation of national governments and has them set at a macro level in the European Union itself. A lot of empirical work shows us that when that happened, national governments could no longer compete on economic policies or less well, and they tend to be much more alike in their policy promises and manifestos across the left-right spectrum. And we see something similar happening in the United States and across the Western democracies. Economic policies of the third way, spearheaded by Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and Gerhard Schroeder, prioritized markets over states, arguing that a rising tide would lift all ships, that if we just kind of liberalize finance and capital in the economies, that all wages and job opportunities would grow. Leaders increasingly prioritized and promised to govern responsibly, i.e. through responsible macroeconomic management. But this has traded off with governing responsively, and we see a lot of empirical literature also showing that the public itself is more pro-redistribution and pro-regulation than either the left or right parties. The organizational infrastructure of parties has become more elite and more nationalized. And finally, the politics industry, as I said earlier, becomes a substitute for voter outreach. If you can really hone the tactics through which you, text people 16 times a day at election time, then you don't really need to sustain party organization at a local level across and between elections. Now, one of the implications has been a growing reliance, at least in the United States, on non-party groups to do the work of, democracy. The rise in 501c4s, and this graph is from the book, but it wasn't updated for the 2024 election, or otherwise you would see a trend in rising finance by these groups. 501c4s and super PACs, as you know, after the Citizens United ruling, are allowed to raise and spend unlimited amounts of money on different races. The caveat is that they're not supposed to work with an individual campaign. But as of a kind of FEC ruling in early 2024, candidates now can coordinate with outside groups on voter canvassing and GOTV, get out the vote efforts, meaning they can share things like the likely voters in a district. And this was something that President Trump used in 2024 when he basically delegated his entire get out the vote effort to Elon Musk's super PAC and a few others, and had very little traditional ground game through party networks like Kamala Harris. Now, non-party actors are problematic because even though their goals may often dovetail with those of parties, i.e. they want to elect the same candidates, non-party actors are not themselves elected. Parties are held accountable through the mechanism of elections in a way that a super PAC is not. They're not held, and they're also often anonymous. So even though you need to disclose donors for some but not all of these groups, the donors can be something like Rob, Dan, and I form a group called Concerned Americans and pool our money that way. And it would just list us as Concerned Americans rather than our individual names, making it very difficult to know where this money comes from. So that's one implication of the reliance on, of sort of the weakening of party organization, is that you increasingly delegate party work outside the party, and that will weaken you further over time. Another implication is a rise in reliance on cultural issues rather than economic issues to win voter support. Now, you do hear a debate in the media about whether or not bread and butter issues dominated in this election. People just cared about the price of eggs. Maybe. We obviously know, though, that people didn't ultimately vote based just on the price of eggs. There was also a lot of appeals based on grievance and identity and fear. Here on the left is just a graph from the United States by Grossman and Hopkins showing that the share of cultural issue mentions has risen in both parties. This is evidence from Peter Hall in 2023 in a Cambridge Elements book showing that in Western European party manifestos, the share of economics mentions has actually kind of declined while the share of cultural mentions has gone up. Now, I'm not hugely in the debate about identity politics per se. So this is just to indicate that when economics becomes less salient, or when the parties are not necessarily making economic promises that are super differentiated from each other, then they are more likely to rely on other kinds of appeals in elections. But the reason that this is a little bit tangled is also because there's been an ongoing class realignment in the neoliberal era. The third way agenda of the 1990s was designed to appeal to skilled workers and the middle classes, not the traditional labor constituencies of the left. The left-right divide has been increasingly blurred by occupational shifts. As we've moved away from a manufacturing economy and become post-industrial, the largest share of the economy of workers is in the service sector, which is very amorphous. Like lawyers are in the service sector, but so are like hotel workers. And it makes it very difficult to have class alignment or a sense of like a class in itself and a class for itself, to use traditional Marxian discourse. And the right and left no longer seem to map on to the economic programs that define the role of state in society. So Donald Trump, I think, very much appeals to the working classes, but not necessarily through an economic program of redistribution. You could argue that the tariffs are supposed to be somewhat working class friendly, but that was, in 2016 at least, that was not the basis of his claims of working class support. Now, we also know that there's been an educational shift in who supports the left and right parties. So in other words, the bases of the left and right parties have been changing. These two graphs reflect the same trend, which is that higher educated voters increasingly vote for the left, whereas lower educated people with less education tend to vote more for the right. And this is a shift in the sort of historical identification of these groups with parties of the left and right. On the left, again, this is all from a book by Grossman and Hopkins called Polarized by Degree, where they show that college-educated people are more likely now to vote for the Democrats. Whereas on the right, this is a bunch of European countries put together, that the conservative parties now and far-right parties draw their bases much more from the working class than parties of the left. So parties of the left have ironically become a party for the higher educated professionals who live in coastal cities, which is not traditionally who they've claimed to represent, and can be very difficult to put together a policy agenda that way. So the overall argument of the book is that party weakness erodes democracy, and it particularly challenges democratic government's ability to manage democratic capitalism. In other work with a co-author, Tabitha Abu-El-Haj, a constitutional law professor, we argue that you could maybe try to create associational parties that have more organizational density at the lower level. This came up at our event yesterday. There have been many successful parties around the world that still rely on grassroots organizing and on a kind of consistent presence in local areas. But also, one implication of not having robust parties that are sort of organizationally dense is that you increasingly get a role for the private sector. Okay, so you have an outsized influence today of wealthy donors in, say, lobbying, policymaking, and any number of campaign finance. But even in other ways, we might see our civic space shaped by big money. And that's, the role of philanthropy or foundations to give money to causes that they care about and to support certain issues being on the political agenda rather than others. Certainly at an institute of higher education, there have been a lot of very high-profile conflicts between donors to universities and, the universities themselves, and it raises the question of whose interests should dominate when so much money is at stake. And finally, it places growing pressure on corporations to solve social problems. Now, this is, I think, the part of the book that I got the most wrong. In the book, I have a few examples of times when private companies were going to step in to do good things for like governance questions. So for example, in 2020, during COVID, when local election groups didn't have enough money, Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg gave like $500 million to local election administration to execute an election during COVID. And there are a lot of other examples through ESG, like environmental, social, and governance goals of corporations, and a lot of their DEI initiatives, that corporations were themselves going to address things like guns in America, or climate change, or racial justice through the actions that they themselves could undertake. There's been a shift from shareholder capital to stakeholder capital, with some of our kind of our largest voices in finance and in tech and kind of major economic sectors arguing that corporations need to be more socially responsible. But very quickly, things seem to have changed in Trump's America. Troublingly so. So at the top, this is just from the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates in 2008, when he launched his foundation, said that, we can use capitalism to solve the world's problems. he's not anti-government, but he just, and I think in good ways, he tried to convince people with high net worth that they should actually care about the rest of the world and maybe devote some resources to the world's problems. But here, the Gates Foundation says that one of its goals is to reimagine inclusive global economies, which is ironic because it seems like the inclusion of an economic system relies on like what that national government decides to undertake as an economic policy rather than what a foundation seems to think is important. We also see that even though donors are super wary right now of the Democratic Party, the Democrats have created a super PAC to target the working class. So recognizing that they shouldn't just be in New York and California at election time, they're going to really try to win working class support. But again, this is a major question. What is the super PAC going to do? How is it going to mobilize the support? It's not acting as a party. And finally, I think that we see a lot of like preemptive capitulation of corporate America to President Trump and how Elon Musk, who is a private citizen acting as a special government employee, they seem to be using the state purely as a lever of like political revenge or political favoritism, which is a very well-known form of governance around the world and is one that the United States also used to be incredibly familiar with. It takes hundreds of years to build a clean state and to establish rule of law, create a neutral civil service. When your civil service and bureaucracy work well, you don't notice. That's the whole point. But as all of those things are under threat today, it's going to raise real questions about who has power and who governs in America and what response we can have, not just in civil society, but also corporate America itself wants to be a civil, sort of civil society actor sometimes, and right now is not acting as one. So if you actually get more alignment between corporate elites and the government, that can look much more like oligarchy than democracy and kind of accelerate the trends from the book in ways that I really didn't imagine. So, Rob, over to you.
All right. Is that working? We assume it's working? Okay. Very sneaky, you. I read very carefully your great book and wrote down a bunch of stuff, and then you added a bunch of new stuff in your slides. People do that. But this is a great book, The Great Retreat. It runs against the grain of a lot of popular discourse about parties, not just popular discourse, but discourses you showed among the increasingly stupid donor class about our need for weaker parties. Didi does a great job. Can we change this slide? Yeah, okay. Okay. Just the cap was freaking me out a little bit. I was just mainly kidding, but that's okay. Okay, thanks. Didi does a great job of something which is very difficult, which is keeping a focus on American parties while always reminding the reader about the broader context of parties in rich democracies. I totally agree with her that we need stronger parties with deeper roots in communities, and this is more controversial among, I think, college students and younger people, but perhaps parties with less internal democracies than U.S. parties currently have. I also agree, and Didi makes the great point that the de-alignment of voters, or this, the de-alignment of voters is maybe as big a problem as effective polarization, the degree to which Americans hate each other because they're in the other party. They're outnumbered, as you know, by people who've kind of given up on electoral politics. I agree with her so much that, given the fact that I'm usually wrong, that makes me worry about a few parts of her explanation of the Great Retreat. I just want to mention a couple of those, and then I'll turn things over to the rest of y'all. So Didi said at the beginning of the book that, the Great Retreat, the change in parties, was too complicated to be driven by just one thing like political economy. But then the book actually goes ahead and argues, I think, pretty well that that is the kind of major engine of these changes among parties. I guess I just want to ask her a little bit more about whether liberalism is to blame. I know liberalism means a lot more than just a smaller state. Sometimes it means, in some circumstances, a larger state. But I think it's worth noting that, I mean, neoliberalism has failed in a lot of respects. It's noteworthy that Doge needs to be illegal to do a lot of what it's doing to the state. You know, and some of Didi's careful to say that the past era of parties being, in her view, normatively preferred to what they are now. You know, in 1930, government expenditures in the US were 3% of GDP. And by the time of the Reagan Revolution, they had gone up 10 times to 32%. And the Reagan Revolution is considered like the one of the kickoff points for neoliberalism, but now it's 36%. So after decades of neoliberalism and blurring between the, as you said, between the two parties on their priorities, at least, and I know that's just one component of neoliberalism, but the size of government has actually grown. And, you know, on the other hand, and as you say that, citing like Hicken and Riedel, that when the state is smaller, that often makes life more difficult to have these kind of parties more integrated in civil society. So I was just wondering about that. One other thing is Didi's also very careful to, no, I'd rather see Musk than me, but anyhow, Didi's careful to note that these periods in which parties were kind of closer to voters, more engaged with voters, and their preferences were ones in which these countries' degree of democracy was a lot lower than it is today, even today, maybe even tomorrow in the case of the US, right? So she's not saying that there was a golden age of parties, but I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more from her about the implications of that level of democracy for thinking about what's caused the Great Retreat. So when the US hadn't gone to universal suffrage and fully democratized until the late 60s, say, that's what enabled the US to have low polarization, this kind of four-party system in Congress. And it's the Democratic Party's embrace of internal party democracy, you know, that didn't happen until and was prompted by their need to kind of crack down, as you note, on Jim Crow parties in the South, right? On cracking down on state party autonomy. And as you know, Southern voters' realignment contributed to polarization. But I think you might think, well, we might think about whether the more democracy in the US itself, instead of not just political economic changes, have weakened parties, right? In the US, speaking of Lipset and Rocan, suffrage restriction greatly reduced the political implications, the partisan implications of a major social cleavage, as some people say, the major social cleavage, right? I mean, in a clear violation of Lipset and Rocan, right? We took the cleavage of race off of party competition through suffrage restriction, and since the 1970s, when full suffrage has returned, now that cleavage has a chance to work in ways that I think might help explain this decline in democracy. Sorry, decline in deeper parties, say. Your great book, which you said was on clientelism, which you said was on the US, it's not, it's on the US and Western Europe. I mean, I was just wondering if the decline of clientelism might be useful for thinking about why these deeper parties have disappeared. That's true and also finally, you know, in the US and Western Europe, the time when the parties had really were most rooted in their communities were when in Western Europe, when these parties were trying to exist in the absence of full democracy. So you said that they weren't just following a logic of electoral competition, in part because they really couldn't, because all of their would-be voters hadn't been enfranchised yet. So just I wonder if you could say a little bit about whether the fact that, I know it doesn't seem like it today, but the fact that these rich countries are more democratic than they were when parties were stronger, those things might be causally related. I have some other thoughts too, but I'm going to shut up for now. And past this, no clapping. Yes. No.
Could we like turn around and just be in a circle?
We've got.
But
Oh, yeah.
they need this for,
Okay.
you can sit there, but just.
Yeah, there are a lot more people online than in person, so,
Oh, great.
yeah.
All right, well, I'll stay here. I certainly can't respond, or I worry that I would not be able to respond succinctly, but Rob, I really want to appreciate your comments, which were trenchant, as usual. And so a few quick things. I should have, and forgot to, gone into more detail about the 1990s. I think this happens as you get older, like you think it was a really recent history, but it's not. And so to Rob's first point about like the size of government has simply grown. I mean, that is something that just happens in states over time, that the size of democracy or the size of the state kind of tends to grow. So that's not necessarily surprising. But on the question of traditional liberalism, I think what I'm trying to argue is not necessarily that states have actually done less, but that they have not provided a compelling explanation to voters that they are doing it, and that it's visible in a way that resonates with people. So in the 90s, the embrace of the third way agenda was a very calculated political strategy to de-emphasize what government is doing, because traditional liberalism had been seen as such a failure in the 1970s. It did lead to an economic recession and crisis, problems of stagnation or stagflation around the world. And I think problems of inflation related to inflation are still resonant today, and governments are very afraid of it. So in the 1980s, when conservative parties were doing very well in places like the US and Britain, parties of the left were really in the wilderness. And I get into debates with people who are kind of pro-DLCers, Democratic Leadership Council in the 1990s, the faction within the Democratic Party that produced the third way agenda and sort of President Clinton's ascendancy from the governor of Arkansas, not typically a hugely prominent political position, to the president of the United States. The argument here was that to be electable, the Democrats could no longer rely on the claims of traditional liberalism or on the promises of it by telling Americans that we're just going to give you these things. So austerity policies and rolling back some aspects of the welfare state were probably, I won't go so far as to say definitely necessary to get out of an economic pinch, but they were seen as politically exigent at the time. And your colleague, Mark Mizrachi, has been very compelling about this as well, that sometimes there were just hard decisions that had to be made by governments. That said, when Bill Clinton proclaimed that the era of big government is over and embraced a lot of policies like conditioning welfare benefits on employment or pursuing NAFTA and the WTO against the vociferous no's of his traditional working class bases of support, that was a calculated decision that there would be new kinds of voters who would then support the Democratic Party, and it took for granted the traditional constituencies. Well, like, who else are unions going to vote for? They're always going to be with us, and in the end, they'll be grateful for this. But there's also a huge literature by Suzanne Mettler and many others about the submerged state, that a lot of the way the American state operates is kind of invisible to Americans through, say, tax expenditures, and through, honestly, a lot of the private sector, where your benefits are delivered in a way where you don't give the government credit or you don't see that it's happening. So politically, people have kind of been oriented to be against government by both parties of the left and the right, albeit to very different degrees, even though they still receive government support and are the beneficiaries of government services. Now, on this question of race in the United States, it's so difficult to try to square comparative theories like Lipset and Rokan with the very unique trajectory of United States political development around this racial cleavage. The realignment of the South did create a more distinguishable Republican and Democratic parties on racial issues. But I'm not sure the extent to which it affected some of the other trends that we're talking about, for example, like the class bases of these parties. And this is a little bit of a dodge, but part of the goal here is to identify the way economic trends that are typically considered exogenous to parties. So a lot of what we see is that, well, like globalization just happened or financialization just happened. We're endogenous to decisions made by leaders, unsurprisingly by conservative leaders, and then somewhat surprisingly by democratic leaders. And to show that when these, when we can see this trend repeat itself over democracies with very different sort of trajectories of political development, then maybe the economic story itself is worth honing in on, even though it necessarily elides or excludes potentially more salient and certainly significant explanations of what's happening to the party system today. And then finally, your question about clientelism and parties, I'm not quite sure how best to answer that, except to say that we have different theories of when you get party building. Okay, and party building, I think you're right that young people, and it seems really old school. It does seem like you're arguing for some kind of golden age of, civic robustness or bowling alley, whatever Putnam talks about, bowling leagues, that simply doesn't exist anymore and never will. But what I'm sort of hoping to argue is there have been times historically when parties were forced to engage in party building. And if we think of the era of clientelism, one of the explanations I think still dominates and is resonant today is Marty Schefter's, that when you have parties that are organizing outside the establishment mainstream parties, they have to organize through different kinds of appeals, and they have to do it in really compelling ways to voters because they don't have access to state subsidies to convince voters that they can give them policies that they need, for example. And then that forces the mainstream parties to then compete on some new grounds. So for Marty Schefter, they had to abandon clientelism when other programmatic issues became more important to the electorate. I'm not quite sure how or if that argument travels to today, except to say that as voters reject mainstream parties in favor of extremes or radicals, either on the right or the left, it's just we happen to see many more on the right, it will certainly force the mainstream parties to adapt, and it would be folly for them not also to engage in the kinds of typical party building that they've historically been able to use. So they have kind of first mover advantage in the political system, and they do have a network that might have atrophied, but is not non-existent. And Steve Bannon in 2020, in one of his podcast episodes, or maybe multiple ones, he also had a website about it, told people that if they were interested in supporting the MAGA movement, they should go to their local Republican Party. He was like, you'll find that it's basically empty, probably doesn't exist, but it exists on paper. It's legally a sort of facet of the National Republican Party. So you can just go to your local Republican Party. You can call yourself the chair. You can run for the office if no one else is. And you'll have, the resources of the Republican Party, not necessarily huge financial resources, but you'll be able to install election poll workers and to sort of know who the local candidates are, to coordinate with the national party if necessary. And that is an extremely, I think, smart and savvy way to kind of infiltrate a party. And the only reason that that's possible is when the party itself has ignored the sort of its local roots. So it's either going to be new parties or it's going to be factions within parties that force parties to change. But they also, if they really want to reestablish linkages with voters, they will have to do it, I think, in an old-fashioned way. But I'm not quite sure what that'll look like.
Great. So Didi, I'm going to actually ask you, because I'm not mic'd, if you click where it says Q&A,
yeah.
Charlotte's got a question, as you can I'm sure imagine.
I am missing a mouse.
Yeah,
oh, thanks.
There you go.
Oh, so Charlotte, come on.
So this way you can actually...
She's written us an essay.
She wrote an essay, so you can read as much as you want, but this way people will be able to see it and hear it, rather than be talking and not being...
Okay. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Ayer. You assume that platform change led to organizational change. Are they the joint manifestation of something else? Okay, following weak parties, strong voting are a symptom, not a cause. The solution is not stronger parties, but something that's not representative democracy as we know it. Is there more of that?
No, that's the end of it.
Okay. I'm not, I don't know if it's the case. So I think what Charlotte is asking, and apologies, Charlotte, if I'm botching it, is that I would not call it a causal story, but at least a sequencing story where parties made certain decisions in two ways. They made policy decisions, and they also made kind of organizational prioritizing decisions. And those have led to a weakening of parties' kind of intermediary function with implications for democracy. Charlotte seems to be arguing it could be the case that something is either prior to parties making those decisions or is kind of jointly affecting some of the different things I talk about, whether it's party weakness or democratic erosion. I think that that's entirely possible. In other words, the institution that I'm highlighting is a kind of is formal in some ways, informal in others, and that's the political party. There's a lot of literature about the institutions themselves, per se, the institutions of the state and of representative democracy that are themselves failing to translate preferences into outcomes. There's been a lot written in the United States, for example, about minoritarianism. Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky just wrote Tyranny of the Minority, maybe not just wrote at this point, it's maybe a year or two old. But there's also even a movement for proportional representation in the United States to create multi-party democracy. And without getting into all of that, I will just say, I'm not sure if it necessarily matters whether or not it's institutions that are causing this, because I don't think that institutional reforms themselves will lead parties to be stronger. I don't believe the claims, which I think are unduly optimistic, that if we changed to a PR system, for example, we'd suddenly get a lot of party building. I think you would actually just have a really strong party of the right, because that's where all the resources are at first. But that's at least in the short term. I think the hope is it would incentivize party building. But I think regardless of what happens with our institutions, you are going to need strong parties for whatever era of democratic renewal we enter, hopefully, in the 21st century. Where I think Charlotte is correct is I think if we just focused on rebuilding parties, I'm not sure we would get better democratic outcomes. I think that it's a kind of a first do no harm type of recommendation. I don't think it's likely that by investing in party building, you'll get worse outcomes, but I think that they could be marginal at best. Now, quickly on this Piketty point of rising educational attainment in the Brahmins, there's also a book by Torben Iversen and I think David Soskis, about capitalism and democracy, where, you know, it is true that the third way agenda was designed not just to appeal to a certain class of voters, but also to benefit, I believe that the left thought it would benefit everyone. And there was an era of peace and prosperity, and there continues to be insanely high economic growth in the United States, and there certainly was in the 1990s. It's certainly not to say that the policy prescription was wrong for its desired outcome. However, it was potentially short-sighted in the kind of levels of inequality and dislocation that would be spurred by some of this structural economic change. And it did very little to compensate the losers from globalization, or to be thoughtful as a political strategy about how you might speak to the people who are not like the clear winners in this economic system. So I do think that there are structural shifts to the economy, a rising middle class and highly educated sector of workers who needed political representation. It just happened to come at the cost of the working class, and I'm not sure that it necessarily needed to. But should we just go to the other?
You just go and close that and then go to the crowd.
Okay, our crowd here?
Our actual audience, yes.
Okay, oh, I see, we can close that. All right, real people.
Real people.
But thank you, Charlotte, that was a great question, as usual.
Awesome. So the amazing talk on the longitudinal variation, so change over time.
Yeah.
You know, down, down, down. We talked a little bit about comparative variation. So in particular, are there places, presumably, you know, maybe in Western Europe, where you say, oh, parties at the center left, parties at the center right, parties with some kind of, you know, historical mainstream parties are showing more grit and more persistence and more popularity than what we're seeing in the US, and then those perhaps fit your theory of why they do what they do and why they might stay more successful. It might help us, some variation might be helpful for thinking about the causes here.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the most difficult questions that people who study democracy get today are like, what are the success stories or where is it holding on? And then trying to generalize from those. So I'm working on a paper now that tries to kind of operationalize a concept of intermediary capacity, and especially with respect to these local organizations. There are a lot of parties that I don't think are necessarily like adapting really well, so much as they're able to hold on by relying on their very traditional party organ. So by that, I mean, there is a kind of crisis of social democracy today. Parties of the left have done worse in, say, 2024 than in some places, like in Germany, the SPD showing was the worst in the entire post-war era this past week. So, but there are some places where the mainstream parties are able to still get plenty of voter support or still sort of keep the extremists at bay by trying to create benefits for members. And they're not necessarily the kind of membership benefits that I think would ever work in the United States, but Susan Scarrow has written a lot of really good policy papers. Some parties have created like a credit card. So if you're a party member, you have access to that credit card. They still have like youth organizations and scholarships. And there have been more experiments with intra-party democracy. They've been a mixed bag. Like the British Conservative Party tried it. There have been, so for leadership contests within the party, they've typically been limited, as Rob mentioned, in their intra-party democracy, where only a set of party elites can make a decision about who the party leader is going to be. They've, in a lot of different places, including Canada, Britain, they've experimented with allowing kind of rank and file members to also cast a vote in leadership contests. And that has done a good job of drawing people into the party membership. But organizationally, it's more that they continue to nurture the way the party has existed in the past, rather than that they're doing something very different. But I would be eager to hear from people who work on places outside the United States, if that's the case. And I'll quickly just plug, we heard yesterday from a scholar of Indian politics who said that Narendra Modi is considered kind of a populist leader who relies on religious nationalism to centralized support, but he's also relied a lot on grassroots organizations and religious groups to build the party at the local level. And it's not in service of purely nationalist or political project. It's often like very community-based and civic, and that provides a very effective backbone of support for the party at election time, because it continues to exist kind of between elections as well.
I mean, even in Germany, the CSU in Bavaria, right? Like they're still getting 40% of the vote. Traditional kind of center-right party.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like it'd be an interesting party to look at. Like how are they holding it? Because part of the center-right are doing. I mean, they're getting creamed by the far, and they're really. I'm looking at the Tories.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
For one thing, I mean, it's look at France, look at Italy.
Yep.
You know, I mean, really, the center. It's not. This is not a problem with the left. The center-right is probably even doing, if anything, worse than the center-left right now. Would be in my estimation. I mean, America still has a functioning party of the center left. It doesn't have a functioning party of the center right.
That's right.
At all. So
yes, and that's very troubling because, according to Ziblatt at least, like the center right is traditionally what keeps radicalism at bay.
Yeah, Democrats to center right now.
I know. And that's what's difficult about a two-party system, is that the opposition party also becomes the like defensive democracy party in times like this. In other places like France and Poland are recent examples, to a much less extent, or that I know far less about. South Korea after the most recent declaration of martial law. You can get coalitions of support against anti-democratic parties and candidates, and that can be a very powerful signal when people who have very different and distinct political interests can come together and say, you know, this one issue of democracy transcends all those other things. That can be powerful. It's more difficult to do in the United States when it's just one other party.
What crap. You want to click on the Q&A again? We've got another question. And again, if you read it from, so if you scroll down.
Yes.
From JT.
All trends from the past 20 years indicate eroding trust in institutions and atomization. What gives you hope that parties can buck that trend? How can party institutions build trust and influence when everything is going the opposite direction? That is a great question. This is definitely an era of sort of decentralization of authority and an erosion of, you know, an established set of hierarchies and expectations in our society. And a lot of those actually reflect little d democratization, a democratization of knowledge, a democratization of access. And so when I first got to Stanford, this was 10 years ago, we continue to have a center on democracy development and rule of law, a lot like the center here on emerging democracies. And we had a program on liberation technology, was what it was called. It was basically the internet, but this was the sort of Arab Spring era and the color revolutions in Eastern and Central Europe. Like how can the internet be used to bring people together and political activists and digital activists to support democracy? And it seemed really promising. And then fast forward to the 2016, 2017 era, when everything is about misinformation and disinformation and how the platforms are going to regulate speech. And now I think that we've even gone, we raised this at the panel yesterday, towards a question about like information at all, like who controls information? How do you assess if information is good, bad, is a political project? With the rise of alternative media and, you know, a lot more hateful digital spaces, what does that mean for the future of democracy when you are activated really in extreme forms online? And even just like the nature of living online, there's a great book by our colleague Eitan Hirsch, who's a political scientist at Tufts, who's written about political hobbyism and the way a lot of polarization is driven not by people who are actively engaged in local communities solving problems, but instead who are just like doing social media likes. Those are the kinds of people who kind of sit on their couch, feel very politically engaged, maybe give money to political campaigns, but are not actually doing any kind of democratic work or you know, community activism in the way that we would expect, although they would themselves say that they're very political. And that habit or that sort of trend of hobbyism is one that is also not great for democracy. It's certainly not any kind of traditional little d democracy building that we have conceptualized in the past. All that said, this erosion of trust in institutions, I think first of all, we can't let these trends just continue. And it is the case that the government does things to benefit people and that our elected officials, I think at least some large set of them, go into public service because they want to actually improve welfare and society in very significant ways. So the hope is not necessarily I don't expect that parties are going to have an easy time reestablishing trust. It's more like you need to start probably very locally with very minor or insignificant expectations. You're not expecting parties to change how people feel about the political system overnight, but it's more like through a series of small wins politically, you can build an agenda that maybe resonates with people more through some kind of iterative process of interest aggregation or doing the actual politics of compromise and negotiation among competing factions to try to find a result that is like 40% what everyone wants instead of 100% what anyone wants. That's the kind of thing that can hopefully try to build back some trust in people who vote for these parties. And the goal, again, is not to suddenly reestablish democratic legitimacy overnight, but to recognize that the status quo is not sustainable and that some kind of alternative might improve things very incrementally. And I think that despite the fact that there's a cacophony of recommendations for what the Democratic Party should do right now, one of the ones that seems pretty common, especially among Democrats from places like Michigan or places like the South, is that you just need to show people that you can do things that work. And when you do that, you can actually make a pretty big difference. So the Democrats who win in red districts, for example, are the ones who can do that pretty effectively. What is Gretchen Whitmer's thing, fill the damn potholes, fix the damn potholes.
Fix the damn roads.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that, again, is not going to change things overnight, but has the potential to change.
Well, as you said, Americans have never liked political parties.
Right.
That's never been the point, or it's not about trust. Trust to me is such a rarefied word for politics.
Yeah.
It seems to me more, just actually doing the job of responsiveness, representation. You can still say, I hate parties, but I like my local congressman. I like my local representatives. I like my mayor.
Right.
I hate parties.
Exactly.
Then that's okay.
Yeah.
hate parties all you want.
I think that the more, this is a much more academic and probably unrealistic answer, but I do also think there's a lot of good thinking going on about post-neoliberalism. And Margaret Levy is thinking a little bit about a politics of human flourishing. There have been a lot of the critiques of neoliberalism that I showed are trying to think about a different politics. And after the 1990s, when Frank Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, although I don't know, he's strawmanned very frequently, but the argument that there's not a substitute for kind of market economies and political democracy, I think is still the case. I don't think it's the case that people will think authoritarianism and repression are suddenly very appealing. But I do think that you can try to think about what something like social democracy looks like in the 21st century. Like, I don't think that we're going to change our reliance on market economies, but we can maybe change our conception of what people deserve or what it is we owe one another, levels of social solidarity, some kind of cross-class appeals. These are the kinds of things that people far smarter than I can try to imagine politically, and then you slowly try to implement those kinds of, I don't know, messages.
Right.
Yeah.
Please. Earlier you mentioned your thoughts on what a multiple party system would look like in the US. And you mentioned something about you thinking that the right group would still continue to be massive and we wouldn't actually have a multiple party system on the right. To take an example local to me, in Denmark, we had a two-party system until, well, an effective two-party system that then expanded onto a multiple party system. And that system now makes it so that parties cannot be weak because weak parties die out and get replaced by stronger parties.
Yeah.
And the mainstream parties cannot be weak because if they do, then new parties get created and swoop in and steal their votes.
Right.
That also makes it so that we don't have a functioning far-right party. Contrary to what happened in Germany, our center-right are actually doing very well. So I'm curious as to what is different in the US than in Scandinavia, where we've seen what I think is a success story from them.
That's a great question. I think that the people who advocate proportional representation are relying on a few different claims about PR, some of which are super compelling. So one is that, I mean, it's potentially more fair just philosophically, that instead of your representation being based purely on geography and having the legislative sort of like seat vote linkage be based on just where you live, it should be based on the aggregate proportion of votes received by a specific party. That theory of proportionality being more democratic is one that other countries like New Zealand and Japan, Italy, Taiwan, places that have reformed their electoral systems in the 90s said, there's something kind of mismatched or misaligned in the way we translate votes into seats, so we should fix that. And I think it's good to think about our institutions' malapportionment and to try to fix it. I think PR advocates are also hoping that in the long run, you get all these other benefits of PR, including like the kinder, gentler politics that Aren Leipart talked about, of consensus building and coalition formation, that you're likely to get dominance in the middle, and by that just like more votes going to the center left and the center right. And there can be other parties, but they're likely to represent not like fringe extreme elements, but instead just represent some interests that can't quite be captured in the middle. So it's not that those things are not likely, it's that they're not likely in the immediate short term. If you look today at the distribution of votes, it probably is the case that you would function better in a four-party system in the US, and that there would be a center-right, a center-left that dominates, and then maybe a far-left, far-right party that aren't even that far. But given the resources within the political system, and by that I mean how donors spend their money, there's a lot of evidence that donors tend to be more ideological than the average American. So if money were going to build parties, which it seems like in the United States, unless you got some change in the Supreme Court, that is what would happen. My expectation is that the best resourced parties right off the bat, the ones that are able to compete in a multi-party system, are ones that can be more ideological than just center parties. I could be wrong. It could be the case that once there's options for a center right and a center left, that you'll have like traditional business interests that just pour their money into the center right and center left. I'm not sure. But given the impact of kind of high net worth individuals rather than traditional like corporate PACs, for example, that have sway in elections, it could be the case that a lot of the kind of activism and excitement and monetary resources would just go to building very like sort of narrow ideological parties at first. It doesn't mean in the long run those parties are the only ones that will be electorally viable, but I just think it would take many election cycles for parties to kind of sort out what the distribution of votes kind of looks like to accurately reflect what the preferences are within the electorate. But if America could be more like Scandinavia, I think that would be good in a lot of ways.
I'm hearing a theme of wanting to sort of reinvest in local politics and initiatives to form a stronger basis for political parties, political organizing. But a question that comes to mind whenever I think about this is always who in the community should be tapped and how should they be tapped to engage in that kind of activity. And one of the things that kind of informs that question for me is understanding the plight of the working class in the United States and how it has declined over the past 30, 40 years as inflation has risen and wages have stagnated. The people who might be interested in engaging in that kind of politics very literally have fewer resources in terms of time and money to actually do that, which to me presents a major challenge to trying to reinvigorate that type of politics. So that's, I guess, more of a comment than a question, but I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Could you kind of reiterate it for the audience online, just to kind of give a sense of what the question was, at least?
It was a great question about basically who has resources to become engaged politically at the local level, and especially if we're noticing that the working class is kind of excluded from politics today, then certainly relying on people to spend their time, their precious time on getting engaged politically could continue to further exclude the working class. So the question is like, who would be tapped to engage in parties locally? I think one of the funniest hypotheses that I've seen about why politics has changed is kind of a bowling alone hypothesis. Bob Putnam has argued in the past that as women entered the workforce, a lot of local politics declined in community groups. And of course, I was like super offended when I was 19 and first read that, but it's kind of a good point. You're absolutely right that for things to be sustained locally, like who gets involved? It's the people who have the time to get involved. But one argument that I've also seen, this kind of gets to JT's question online too, is that increasingly it is still the case, however, there's local organizations that are trying to get things done in community groups. And you've seen a lot of parent activism around like schools for any number of reasons in the COVID era. So it's about school reopening and COVID practices, but also about school boards and what's on in libraries and that kind of thing. You know, people manage to find a way to get involved in things that they care about. But a lot of times the kind of nonprofit community organization, advocacy and activist groups are also themselves oriented to be anti-party. So this is not really answering your question about who gets involved, but it's just to say, to the extent that there is sometimes a local political ecosystem, it's one that can capitalize also on like sort of attacking parties for what they're not doing and trying to get people involved by saying, like, we need to build kind of people-based power. At least that's what I see a lot in the community of Oakland where I live. And that kind of can continue to further erode trust in the established political institutions that we ultimately will need to be responsive to a lot of these interests. So one way of tapping the people is just to go find who are already the community leaders that exist in these local areas and get them more involved in the political party itself. So rather than trying to be at odds with one another, have political parties try to establish, just as the Democratic Party and labor unions used to have, just a more consistent partisan linkage with some of the community groups that exist. But you're also right that labor parties used to be responsible for recruiting members of the working class into politics. And Noam Lupu and Nick Carnes have done really great work showing that parties of the left in particular have less and less working class representatives. And in order for parties to once again try to represent working class people through working class representatives, it also seems like local parties are going to be pretty critical to trying to find who are like the local leaders who are doing a really good job on the school board, for example, or in their local union that can then be tapped for higher up party activity. That has been like a mechanism for recruitment into the party that itself has eroded as well. But finally, on this question of resources, I'll also just point to a longstanding inequality in American politics that people with more resources get more involved. So like Schatzsnyder's quote of like the pluralist the secret of the pluralist heavens that it sings in an upper class accent or whatever in the United States. I'm not sure that we'll ever get rid of participatory inequality in the US, but in order to create some hope for a future where there's less like enormous time burdens and economic burdens on working class people, we will need a politics that like responds to those needs. And it seems like the only way to do that is through established parties.
But isn't it kind of the case when we talk about this idea that Democrats have abandoned the working class? I mean, aren't we really talking about the white working class overwhelmingly here? I mean, African-American working class voters still overwhelming with the Democratic Party, Latinos still overwhelmingly, I mean, less so in 2024.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, I kind of, every time I hear this sort of like, oh, you know, Democrats don't care about ordinary people, sort of like, well, maybe you're talking about like white people without a college education. There's other kinds of ordinary people in the world. I mean, so don't you think that in some ways, to push back a bit here, the Democratic Party has been responsive to the working class? It's just not the white working class in a way.
I personally don't think that, but well, Rob, go ahead.
I just wonder along those lines if if you have any thoughts on this Hacker Pearson research that's recently shown that paradoxically is that Democrats rely more on left-wing billionaires, like their policy agenda and actually their actual policies are on material stuff is to the left compared to the 90s, 80s.
Okay, so my response, I suppose, is that—
I've seen that in perspective.
Yes, and we were on an HEPSA panel last year.
And you let them have it.
I don't want to let them have it. I do think that the Democratic Party has moved to the left or has moved to the right for all segments of the working class. And I think that there's actually angst among like voters of color within the Democratic Party about the extent to which they should still be loyal to the Democratic Party. No, I mean, the alternative is not better.
Audience.
Right. But like, you know, Black women maybe are taken for granted by the Democratic Party. And so I do think that a lot of the anxieties about the working class are about the white working class. That is undoubtedly the case. And I certainly think that when the Republicans talk about the working class, they're trying to make a lot of appeals just to white segments of that. I am troubled and not a behaviorist by any means, but I'm like confused, I suppose, by some evidence indicating that as America becomes more multiracial, that we can't expect racial groups to be very predictable in their voting behavior. And so there's maybe some evidence showing that, yeah, like you said, like certain, especially Hispanic men, have voted for Trump in higher numbers in 2024 than they did in 2020. I think there's some anxiety about like Asian Americans in suburbs and whether or not they're really going to be reliably Democratic. And that, again, is kind of a question of party building. Like if the Republicans want to go into those districts and try to win that support, I think it's a little bit up for grabs. And I think similarly, if the Democrats want them to become reliably basis of Democratic support, they also need to convince them that they do something for them. But Rob, what was your question? Oh, about Hacker and Pearson. I mean, I think that it's the case that the Democratic Party has not abandoned its social democratic goals. So like poverty reduction or reduction of inequality or it is still the party of labor, public education, and any number of other causes that it's always supported. I'm not sure what it means when they say that the policies have become more left. I don't know if that means they're more redistributive or—
That's mainly like taxing wealthier people more, doing more downward redistribution.
I certainly think that there's still like a salient left-right divide between the Democrats and the Republicans, and that on any economic policy, the Democrats will be more to the left. But I think going back to like Chloe Thurston and Dan Galvin's article about the ACA, there's been some kind of bad politics in the Democratic Party about establishing the feedback mechanisms for some of the large policies that they've passed. The ACA, and also some of the big national policies of the Obama and Biden administrations were like pass-throughs to the private sector, right? So the ACA is a mandate on the one hand, but it's also like making sure that we all have private insurance. And a lot of the CHIPS infrastructure bills are ways to invigorate the economy in ways that will probably like hopefully reduce inequality or help the working class or build jobs, but are not, again, seen as highly redistributive, or the policies that we would associate with traditional liberalism, and were kind of wonky. A lot of times the projects like that go to districts are funneled financially in ways that are very invisible to the voters there. So it depends on how politicians claim credit, how they're made visible to the local populations, and how these feedback mechanisms are established. I certainly think that voters think that the Democrats are more redistributive than Republicans, and they are, but it's just that they're not really a policy they're not, since the 1990s, the Democrats are not as much to the left as they were in the eras before.
Great. That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Didi, both for
Thanks,
again,
Dan.
again for today. Rob, amazing interactions and contributions. So
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Dan.
for-
Thanks, everyone online.